Hello, symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, religious studies PhD and university lecturer or professor, depending on the country you're in. And this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. As part of spooky season, we will cover a few different demons. And today's episode is going to be dedicated to the demon or goddess Astaroth. We will see that it's a bit complicated. As always, when we look at the history of religions, things are always more complicated. The mainstream media wants to make it to be. It's always so much easier to draw a very neat and clean explanation when in reality things are always much messier. So, yeah, I hope that you enjoy this episode. And if you like everything, all the dark sides of esotericism, I would highly recommend that you guys sign up for my online course, The Left Hand Path of Magic. It's on my website, drangelapuca.com. And I think that you're going to very much enjoy it if you enjoy every left hand path demon related topics. So, now let's start. There is something so unsettling about the fate of Astaroth. Even though unsettling isn't quite the right word for what amounts to 3,000 years of calculated theological vandalism. What began as veneration of the Phoenician goddess Astarte has undergone such violent transformation that one hesitates to call it evolution at all. It's more akin to watching a portrait being systematically defaced, stroke by stroke, until the original subject becomes unrecognizable save for the ghostly outline beneath. The journey from goddess to demon, from feminine to masculine, from giver of sovereignty to poisonous pedagogue of the forbidden arts, tells us rather less about the nature of divinity than it does about the anxieties of those who rewrote the history. Russell termed this the polemical process of demonization, though even this clinical phrase barely captures the vindictiveness of the transformation. We're not simply observing theological revision here, but something more visceral, what Kelly recognized as deliberate linguistic sabotage, wherein the very name Astaroth, as it appears in biblical text, functions as what can only be described as a weaponized mispronunciation. The Hebrew scribes, in their peculiar genius for theological insult, grafted the vowels of boshet, shame, onto the consonantal skeleton of Astarte's name, creating not a translation but a perpetual sneer frozen in scripture. One finds this technique employed throughout Kings and Chronicles, where the formula Astoret, the abomination of the Sidonians, appears with the regularity of a liturgical response. Though whether this repetition betrays confidence or anxiety remains an open question. The persistence of certain qualities through these transformations proves oddly revealing. Milton, writing in Paradise Lost in 1667, perhaps inadvertently preserved something essential when he observed that spirits like Astarte can either sex assume or both. This isn't just poetic fancy, but an acknowledgement, however unconscious, of a fluidity that predates our modern taxonomies of gender and divinity. The liminal quality that makes Astaroth so difficult to categorize, neither wholly one thing or another, might actually be the most authentic element to survive the centuries of theological revision. Contemporary occultists have seized upon this ambiguity, though we could suspect their interpretations tell us as much about 21st century preoccupations as they do about ancient mysteries. Now, let's look at the philological and historical foundations. But first, allow me to remind you that this project of delivering free academic scholarship based on peer-reviewed sources, my own analysis of primary sources on all things esoteric, can only exist thanks to your support. So if you have the means, please consider supporting my work, joining my fantastic Patreon community, sending donations on PayPal, joining my Ko-fi, YouTube membership, super thanking me in the comments, and checking out my services at drangelapuca.com. Any kind of support really helps, so I would really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing so. And also, you can For free, you can sign up for my newsletter and stay up to date with everything that I do, because otherwise social media algorithms will be a bit flimsy. So you better sign up for my newsletter. Also, it's not censored by all the social media shenanigans, so definitely recommend. Now, back to our topic. The genealogy of Astaroth reads less like a family tree than a record of successive colonizations, each culture overriding the last while somehow never quite managing to erase what came before. If we accept Wolkstein and Kramer's positions of Sumerian Inanna as the originary figure, we are confronted with a goddess whose mythology of descent and return would haunt Western religious imagination long after her name had been forgotten. The progression from Inanna to Akkadian Ishtar to Phoenician Attart appears straightforward enough on paper, yet each transition marks not just translation but profound reimagining. Archaeological evidence from Ugarit, dating to roughly the 1400 BCE, reveals an Astarte who governed not just fertility but warfare, not merely love but political sovereignty, a combination that would prove increasingly intolerable to emerging monotheistic sensibilities. What the Israelite tradition did to this figure is quite incredible. They has shown convincingly that the transformation from Astarte to Astaroth wasn't linguistic drift, but calculated defacement. What the Masoretic scribes achieved through their system of cere perpetuum, ensuring that the goddess's name could never be pronounced without simultaneously invoking shame. Yet Dever points to something rather more interesting. The archaeological record suggests that many Israelites continued venerating some form of the goddess well into the monarchic period, making the biblical polemic less a record of victory than an ongoing argument, perhaps even with the scribes' own communities. The vehemence of the denunciation might actually index the persistence of what was being denounced. The gender transformation presents its own puzzles. By the medieval period, as Russell documents, Astaroth appears consistently as male in morality, plays, and exempla, having somehow acquired a penis along with a position of Grand Duke of Hell. This shift accomplished several theological objectives simultaneously, though whether these were conscious or just convention remains unclear. It certainly neutralized whatever sexual threat the goddess posed to patriarchal religious structures, while creating what one might call a prophylactic distance from the more obviously erotic elements of the original cult. Yet the transformation was never quite complete. Traces of the feminine divine persist in unexpected places, not least in the plural form Astaroth in Hebrew, which could refer to multiple manifestations of the goddess, or in the Hellenistic syncretism that merged Astarte with Aphrodite and Venus. Even in later demonological texts, Astaroth retains Venusian associations that seem to remember, however dimly, an earlier identity. The Renaissance grimoire tradition performed a curious alchemy with Astaroth, transforming biblical abstraction into something almost embarrassingly concrete. Johann Weyer's Pseudomonarchia Daemonum from 1563 provides what amounts to a field guide entry, a great and strong duke coming forth in the shape of a foul angel, sitting upon an infernal dragon and carrying on his right hand a viper. The specificity here is remarkable, as though Weyer were describing a species of exotic bird rather than a fallen divinity. His warning about Astaroth's noisome breath, requiring protection via a silver ring blessed with sacred names, suggests either genuine belief in the operational reality of these procedures or an impressive commitment to maintaining the fiction. The textual transmission from Weyer through Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft from 1584 to the anonymous compilers of the Lemegeton reveals how actively these traditions were curated and expanded. Peterson has traced the editorial intervention that transformed Weier's relatively brief descriptions into the complete magical system found in the Ars Goetia, compiled sometime between 1640 and 1660. Here, Astaroth becomes the 29th spirit among 72, commanding 40 legions and teaching all liberal sciences, a portfolio that seems oddly bureaucratic for a demon. The Ars Goetia offers something particularly intriguing in its claim that Astaroth giveth true answers of things past, present, and to come. He will declare wittingly how the spirits fell, if desired, and the reason of his own fall. This positions the demon not as a tempter, but as professor, holding office hours for those brave or foolish enough to attend. The French grimoires of the 18th century would push this administrative aspect further. Le Dragon Rouge, circa 1750, makes Astaroth Hell's treasurer, a position that speaks volumes about Enlightenment anxieties regarding proper accounting practices, even in the infernal realm. The Grimorium Verum from 1817 extends his dominion to include the Americas, a detail that rather poignantly dates the text's colonial context. Waite in 1911 identified what he called a double logic operating in these texts, where spirits are simultaneously portrayed as mortally dangerous and invaluable sources of knowledge. This paradox, far from being a weakness in the tradition, might actually be its most honest aspect. The elaborate protections required, multiple circles, triangles, divine names, specific instances, suggest genuine ambivalence about trafficking with such forces. Yet the knowledge promised, mathematics, handicrafts, the liberal arts, seems almost quaint in its modesty. One doesn't risk one's soul for basic geometry, surely, unless perhaps the geometry in question is of a rather different order than what we learn in school. Colin de Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal from 1818 provided the visual crystallization of these textual traditions through Louis Le Breton's engravings, fixing Astaroth in popular imagination as an emaciated humanoid figure with reptilian features astride a dragon. The image manages to be simultaneously repulsive and compelling, rather like the entire grimoire tradition itself. What these magical books accomplished was a fundamental shift from prohibition to procedure. Where biblical texts offered only condemnation, grimoires provided methodology, transforming theological boogeymen into what amounts to difficult but potentially profitable business partners. This distinction between religious demonology and operational magic continues to define contemporary occult practice, really. If the grimoire tradition concerned itself with making Astaroth operational, theological writers had rather different anxieties, using this figure to articulate fears about everything from intellectual pride to the dangerous allure of Cartesian doubt. The demon became, in effect, a sort of theological Rorschach test, revealing far more about the interpreters than the interpreted. Sébastien Michaelis' Admirable Histoire from 1612 presents a particularly fascinating case. Written as it was during the Loudun possessions, that extraordinary theatre of religious and sexual hysteria that would captivate France for decades, Michaelis accused Astaroth of corrupting nuns through what he termed rationalist philosophies, a charge that seems almost prescient given that Descartes was just beginning to develop his method of systematic doubt. The timing is too perfect to be entirely coincidental. Whilst philosophers in their studies were learning to doubt everything except the thinking itself, exorcists were battling a demon who supposedly taught the same principles to cloistered women. Desserteau in 1970 reads the Loudun possessions as expressing profound cultural anxieties about emerging rationalism, though one might equally suggest that attributing philosophical innovation to demonic influence was simply the 17th century's way of saying that some ideas were too dangerous for general consumption, particularly when the general consumption in question involved young women already skating on the thin ice of religious ecstasy. The association of Astaroth with sloth requires more careful unpacking than it typically receives, largely because medieval acedia bears almost no resemblance to what we moderns mean by laziness. When Ulrich Bonner's Der Edelstein in 1349 first positioned Astaroth among the archdevils of the seven deadly sins, depicting him as a donkey, this wasn't about simple physical inactivity. Aquinas had already sophisticated the concept in his Summa Theologiae, defining acedia as sorrow about spiritual good, a formulation that transforms sloth from mere idleness into something approaching existential despair. Wenzel in 1960 captures something essential when describing these as affectlessness or a lack of any feeling about self or other, though even this doesn't quite convey the horror medieval theologians felt toward this particular sin. To be slothful, in this sense, was to look at divine grace and feel nothing, to be offered infinite love and respond with a shrug. The donkey symbolism grows richer when we remember Astarte's sacred lions. The goddess's noble beasts have become beasts of burden, stubborn and degraded, though perhaps there's something rather dignified about a donkey's refusal to be harried, a quality that theological writers seem to have missed entirely. The visual tradition crystallized wonderfully, or perhaps horribly, in Le Breton's illustrations for the 1863 edition of Desplancy Dictionnaire Infernal. The Astaroth who emerges from these engravings, emaciated and reptilian, clutching his serpent whilst riding his impossible wolf-dragon hybrid, wearing a crown that seems more burden than ornament, presents a figure of such concentrated misery that one wonders whether the real warning isn't against trafficking with demons, but against becoming one. Simon in 2018 makes the rather brilliant observation that Le Breton's Astaroth could pass for an Enlightenment philosophe, were it not for the monstrous accoutrements. And indeed, there's something about that sneer that suggests too many evenings in Parisian salons arguing about whether God could create a stone too heavy for himself to lift. The dictionnaire appeared during fierce debates about secular education in France, and one can help reading the image as encoding a very specific anxiety. What if rational inquiry, taken to its logical conclusion, leads not to enlightenment, but to this hunched, serpent-clutching misery? The gender transformation from Astarte to Astaroth deserves its own monograph, though Ruther in 1974 has made a solid beginning in religion and sexism. The shift from female to male accomplished multiple theological objectives so efficiently that we could suspect it was more instinct than strategy. A goddess of sexuality and sovereignty simply couldn't exist within Christian cosmology without fundamental disruption. A male demon teaching mathematics and handicrafts posed far less systemic threat. Medieval mystery plays invariably presented Astaroth as male, often as a sort of infernal prosecutor arguing cases against human souls, as in the Mystère de la Passion, circa 1450. Moore in 1995 notes that such roles would have been unthinkable for female characters in medieval drama, but I think there's something else at work here. The transformation allowed theologians to preserve the entity's associations with knowledge and judgment whilst severing the more troublesome connections to fertility and female autonomy. The masculine Astaroth could be dangerous without being fundamentally destabilizing to patriarchal order. The 19th century occult revival was somewhat extraordinary with Astaroth, though whether we should call it a rehabilitation psychological integration or simply the triumph of Romanticism over orthodoxy remains deliciously unclear. What began as theological prohibition transformed into esoteric invitation, and the figure who had served as Christianity's cautionary tale became occultism's professor emeritus. Alphonse Louis Constant, better known as Eliphas Levi, deserves credit or blame for initiating this transformation with his Dogme rituel de la haute magie from the 1850s. Levy's stroke of genius, if we can call it that, was to suggest that goetic demons weren't external entities at all, but psychological forces swimming about in what he termed the astral light. That wonderfully vague medium he imagined connecting everything to everything else. Under this reading, Astaroth became not a literal demon, but the Venusian current of desire and hidden wisdom, which sounds rather less threatening than poisoning breath and dragon mounds, though perhaps no less dangerous for being psychological rather than pneumatological. McIntosh in 1972 suggested Levy was trying to synthesize Enlightenment rationalism with Romantic mysticism and create a system where educated Victorians could practice magic without abandoning their scientific pretensions. This is quite a touching attempt to have one's theological cake and eat it too. Though whether Levy's psychological interpretation was sincere or simply good marketing to an increasingly secular audience remains an open question. The French occult school that followed Levy took his ideas and ran with them in directions he might not have entirely approved. Stanislas de Guaita, through his Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross, embedded Astaroth within elaborate correspondences to the Tree of Life, specifically within the cliffotic spheres, those shells or husks of divine emanation that Kabbalists regard as either cosmic waste products or necessary shadow aspects of divinity, depending on whom you ask. His La Clé de la Magie Noire from 1897 treats these supposedly fallen forces not as irredeemable evil, but as divine emanation requiring reintegration. A remarkably optimistic reading that transforms demonology into a sort of cosmic recycling program. Papillon pushed this systematization further in his Traité méthodique de magie pratique from 1898, assigning Astaroth specific colors, metals, and planetary influences that deliberately preserved connections to the ancient goddess whilst dressing them in Hermetic philosophy. The green and copper associations with Venus seem almost too obvious, yet there's something rather moving about these French occultists carefully preserving feminine divine attributes within their masculine demon, like pressed flowers hidden in a grimoire. The Golden Dawn's treatment of Astaroth, particularly through MacGregor Mather's translation of the Lesser Key of Solomon from 1904, brought an almost bureaucratic precision to demon work that feels distinctly British in its love of proper procedure. Working with Crowley before their inevitable falling out, Mothers embedded the Goetic spirits within the Golden Dawn's Byzantine system of grades, passwords, and ceremonies, treating demons as cliffotic shells that required careful handling but offered valuable insights to those who approached them correctly. Regardy would later explain these as forces that, though apparently evil, contain within themselves the seeds of their own redemption, which sounds rather like Victorian social reform applied to the infernal realm. Though perhaps that's precisely what it was. The notion that even demons might be improved through proper education and systematic treatment reflects a particularly optimistic moment in Western occultism. Crowley's contribution, predictably, was to make everything simultaneously more psychological and more transgressive. His edition of the Goetia from 1904 and the correspondences in Liber 777 from 1909 treated spirits like Astaroth as aspects of the unconscious mind accessible through ritual practice. A reading that Kaczynski in 2010 credits with revolutionizing magical practice by making it possible to engage with the entire Western magical tradition without accepting its theological premises. The fact that Crowley's Do Thou Wilt sounds remarkably like what earlier inquisitors accused demons of teaching seems less ironic than inevitable. Perhaps the demonic has always been whatever a culture considers too dangerous for general consumption. Contemporary left and path traditions have gone further still, often explicitly reuniting Astaroth with the goddess origins that centuries of theologian revision attempted to obscure. Michael W. Ford's Luciferian witchcraft makes no bones about identifying Astaroth with Astarte Ishtar, presenting the figure as a guide to sovereignty and gnosis rather than a source of corruption. Astaroth is the shadow of the goddess, carrying her wisdom through millennia of suppression. According to Ford, Astaroth is the shadow of the goddess, carrying her wisdom through millennia of suppression. And whilst one might question the historical accuracy of this claim, there's something undeniably powerful about this act of theological recovery, or perhaps revenge. And if you want to know more about Luciferian currents and everything Left and Path, don't forget to sign up for my Left and Path course on my website, drangelapuca.com. The demonology movement, particularly as articulated by Connelly, represents perhaps the most complete inversion of traditional grimoire practice. Rather than commanding demons through divine names and protective circles, demonology approaches entities like Astaroth as divine beings deserving reverence, employing demonic ends like Tasa Alora for an Astaroth as mantras for meditation rather than formulae for constraint. Some practitioners believe that they are genuinely contacting ancient goddess energies, while others believe they are contacting psychological archetypes. Regardless, they've transformed the relationship of dominion into one of devotion, which might be the most radical reimagining of all. The visual trajectory of Astaroth fascinates precisely because images seem to remember what texts try to forget. Even the most deliberate theological vandalism can't quite erase the iconographic DNA, if we can call it that, which persists through transformation like those pentimenti that show through old paintings, revealing the artist's earlier intentions beneath the final surface. Consider what survives. Astarte's lions become dragons or wolves in the demonic representations, but they remain fundamentally leonine in their suggestion of sovereignty. Even if that sovereignty has gone feral, the goddess held serpents as symbols of wisdom and regeneration, and whilst medieval artists turned these into emblems of temptation, they couldn't quite suppress the sense that the demon knows something worth knowing. Cornelius traces these iconographic continuities, though I think he understates just how subversive this persistence really is. The crown remains atop Astaroth's head in virtually every depiction, and whilst we are meant to read it as infernal authority, there's something almost poignant about this insistence on royalty, as if the artists couldn't quite bring themselves to complete the degradation. Marinatos points out that the eight-pointed star of Venus appears with remarkable consistency across cultures as Astarte's symbol. And whilst this celestial association gets buried under layers of Christian symbolism, it resurfaces in the Grimoires' insistence on Venusian correspondences, copper talismans, and Friday observances. Complete erasure, it seems, proved impossible, though whether this represents unconscious preservation or deliberate resistance remains tantalizingly unclear. Louis Le Breton's illustration for the 1863 edition of Desplancy's Dictionnaire Infernal deserves its status as the definitive image, though not perhaps for the reasons usually given. Yes, the emancipated body suggests spiritual starvation, and yes, the reptilian extremities imply cold calculation. But look closer at that contemplative posture, the way Astaroth seems to be pondering something just beyond the frame. Leckrich reads these as embodying 19th century fears about rational inquiring leading to spiritual emptiness, which is persuasive as far as it goes, but there's something else happening here. The bat wings, which transform Ishtar's celestial wings into something nocturnal and chthonic, might actually be the most honest element in the image. After all, knowledge that's been driven underground does become a creature of darkness, not by nature but by necessity. The sigil of Astaroth from the Ars Goetia operates on an entirely different register, compressing meaning into geometric abstraction that bypasses representational anxiety altogether. Skinner and Rankin have traced the manuscript variations, and whilst they focus on corruption through copying errors, I'm more interested in what might be deliberate innovations, each scribe adding their own understanding to the symbol. Carson calls these sigils graphic mantras, which gets at something important about how they function as focal points for consciousness, though the comparison to Eastern practices might obscure the specifically Western magical grammar at work here. The circular elements suggest containment and completion, whilst the angular projections imply force that refuses to be contained, which is a visual paradox that rather perfectly captures Astaroth's liminal status. Contemporary occult art has taken these historical threads and woven something genuinely new. But whether we should call it restoration, revision, or revenge depends largely on your theological commitments. Artists like Linda Falorio create images that are simultaneously beautiful and disturbing, serpentine and stellar, refusing the binary choice between goddess and demon that centuries of theological revision tried to impose. Granholm documents this contemporary visual tradition, though his academic distance perhaps prevents him from acknowledging just how politically charged these reimaginings really are. When artists depict Astaroth as androgynous or explicitly feminine, incorporating the eight-pointed star of Ishtar and the lunar crescent of Astarte, they're not simply correcting historical error, but creating new possibilities for divine imagination. Let's look at the practical rituals now. The evolution in how practitioners approach Astaroth ritually tells us as much about changing concepts of spiritual authority as it does about the entity itself. The shift from adversarial constraint to something approaching collaboration, or at least negotiation, maps rather neatly onto broader cultural movements from hierarchical to networked models of power. It would be interesting to see whether the spirits have noticed this change in management style between past and present. The classical grimoire methods preserved in the Ars Goetia read like a combination of military strategy and Asmat protocol. The requirement for a gold seal prepared during specific planetary hours, multiple protective circles inscribed with divine names, and that curious silver ring held against the face to prevent corruption from the demon's noisome breath, all encode a very specific theology of spiritual danger. Peterson provides the technical details, but what strikes me is the assumption that even the demon's words carry contagion, that knowledge itself might be a form of pestilence. Fanger suggests the breath becomes a metaphor for corrupted logos, divine speech inverted, which is elegant but perhaps overcomplicated. Maybe the authors just thought demons would have terrible halitosis after centuries in hell. The specification of Wednesday nights between 10 and 11, corresponding to Mercury's influence over communication, inadvertently admits that even within this framework of constraint, Astaroth's essential nature as revealer of secrets demanded acknowledgement. The Renaissance brought Paracelsian influences that began to treat demons as natural forces rather than purely malevolent entities, a shift that Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia from 1533 articulates with remarkable sophistication. The introduction of sympathetic correspondences, specific suffumigation, colored candles, as well as gemstones, suggests a movement from forced compliance to something more like diplomatic protocol. For Astaroth, copper items and green silk became standard, preserving those Venusian associations that apparently nothing could quite suppress. Reads these as the naturalization of the supernatural. But I think it's more interesting than that. It represents an acknowledgement that if you're going to work with these forces, you might as well work with their nature rather than against it. The Golden Dawn's approach represents something genuinely new, though they dressed it in enough ceremonial complexity to obscure the radical nature of the shift. Their Z2 document, which Zalewski from 1990 analyzes in detail, treats demonic evocation as psychological integration and suggests that which appears as demon from without is revealed as an integrated force from within. The extensive preparations, the robing in specific colors, the preliminary invocations of one's holy guardian angel all serve to transform what had been spiritual warfare into something more like Jungian psychotherapy with really elaborate props. Regardy was quite explicit about this psychological framework, which allowed Victorian practitioners to engage with grimoire traditions whilst maintaining that they weren't really trafficking with literal demons. Heaven forbid. Contemporary demonology has thrown out the entire adversarial model, which Connelly documents with the enthusiasm of someone who has discovered that the emperor's protective circles were never wearing any clothes. Instead of constraints and commands, practitioners create welcoming spaces, offer devotional prayers, and treat Astaroth as honored teacher rather than dangerous prisoner. A typical ritual might involve green candles and copper items. Those correspondences just won't die. Offerings of wine and flowers, and the chanting of that mysterious N, Tassa allora foren Astaroth, whose origin nobody seems quite sure about, but everyone agrees sounds appropriately otherworldly. The power dynamic has completely reversed. Instead of compelling appearance and demanding answers, practitioners invite presence and request teaching. Whether this makes the practice more or less dangerous rather depends on whether you think the danger was ever external to begin with. Chaos magicians predictably have stripped away most of the ceremonial apparatus whilst keeping what they consider the operative core. Carroll treats goetic spirits as information fields, accessible through gnosis states, which sounds very modern and scientific until you realize he's basically describing transpossession with Silicon Valley vocabulary. Hine describes working with Astaroth through visualization and automatic writing, noting that whether the demon exists objectively becomes irrelevant if useful information emerges from the practice. This pragmatic approach offends traditionalist unbelievers equally, which might be precisely the point. Astaroth's contemporary renaissance, if we can call it that without irony, reflects anxieties and aspirations that would have baffled medieval demonologists but might have made perfect sense to the ancient priests of Astarte. The figure has become a kind of spiritual Rorschach test for 21st century occultism that reveals as much about our current moment as any historical precedent. The feminist reclamation of Astaroth proceeds from a rather brilliant insight that the transformation from goddess to demon perfectly exemplifies what Christ in 1979 called the murder of the goddess within Western religion. Contemporary feminist witchcraft doesn't simply reverse this process, but interrogates it, using Astaroth as a case study in theological suppression and recovery. Mura writes about reclaiming all that was demonized in woman: sexuality, power, wisdom, autonomy. Though one might ask whether accepting the Church's equation of female power with the demonic doesn't inadvertently reinforce the very categories being challenged. Stratton provides more sophisticated analysis and demonstrates how the demonization of goddesses served specific political functions in establishing monotheistic authority. The practice of invoking Astaroth alternatively as male and female, which has become common in feminist circles, seems less about historical accuracy than about destabilizing the entire gender binary that made the original demonization possible. LGBTQ plus practitioners have found in Astaroth's gender fluidity and marginal status a patron saint of sorts for those existing outside Orthodox categories. Recent ethnographic work from McGill University documents correlations between queer identity and attraction to goetic magic that go beyond simple rebellion against religious conservatism. Practitioners describe Astaroth as patron of those who exist between categories, which resonates with Lee's theorization that both queerness and occultism represent knowledge practices marginalized by hegemonic structures. The demon who was neither properly masculine nor appropriately feminine, neither saved nor utterly damned, becomes a guide for navigating contemporary experiences of non-binary existence. Neo-Luciferian philosophy has positioned Astaroth within frameworks that emphasize individual sovereignty and Gnostic illumination, though the grandiosity of some claims makes academic assessment challenging. Querying presents Astaroth as one of the 9 demonic gatekeepers, which sounds like a video game but represents serious magical practice for thousands of practitioners. His claim that Astaroth teaches discrimination between authentic gnosis and mere information in our age of information overload is actually rather astute, even if the packaging makes academics cringe. The emphasis on conscious rebellion against limiting structures, whether theological, political, or psychological, positions Astaroth as teacher for those who have concluded that orthodox wisdom might be neither orthodox nor wise. The academic legitimization of Western esotericism, particularly through institutions like the University of Amsterdam's Center of History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, has enabled scholarly engagement that neither dismisses nor endorses these practices. Hanegraaff and his colleagues have created space for studying figures like Astaroth as cultural phenomena worthy of serious analysis. Asprem argues that contemporary occultism reveals important insights about meaning-making in secular societies, treating Astaroth as a screen onto which practitioners project anxieties about knowledge, power, and transcendence. This scholarly attention has produced critical editions of grimoires and ethnographic studies that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. So, to conclude, after 3,000 years of transformation, Astaroth emerges as something far more interesting than either the goddess worshippers or the demon hunters imagined. A figure that demonstrates the impossibility of permanent theological victory. Every attempt to fix meaning, to establish final interpretation, to achieve complete suppression or perfect restoration fails in fascinating ways. The goddess becomes demon, then becomes psychological complex, then becomes liberatory symbol. And each transformation adds layers without quite erasing what came before. What persists across all these metamorphoses isn't any essential nature, but rather a cluster of associations that seem remarkably resistant to suppression. Knowledge that challenges authority, power that refuses proper categorization, wisdom that comes at uncomfortable cost. The medieval warning about Astaroth's pestilential breath takes on new meaning when we consider that dangerous knowledge might indeed be contagious, spreading from mind to mind despite all attempts at quarantine. The theological attempt to contain and condemn paradoxically preserved exactly what it sought to suppress, encoding the goddess's attributes into the demon's description with such fidelity that contemporary practitioners can reverse engineer the original from its supposed corruption. Encoding the goddess's attributes into the demon's description with such fidelity that contemporary practitioners can reverse engineer the original from its supposed corruption. The demonologists, it turns out, were terrible at their job, or perhaps too good at it, creating an archive of everything they feared rather than achieving its erasure. For scholars, Astaroth offers a nearly perfect case study in symbolic resilience, demonstrating how meaning survives through apparent negation, how the repressed returns in displaced form, how today's heresy becomes tomorrow's orthodoxy. For practitioners, the figure provides something more immediate, a focal point for exploring whatever their current tradition considers marginal, forbidden, or impossible. Both might agree The Astaroth reminds us that meaning is never quite as fixed as authorities would prefer, that wisdom often dwells in places orthodoxy fears to tread, and that what one era calls fallen, another might recognize as rising. The story ultimately suggests that divine narratives, once established in human consciousness, cannot be destroyed but only transformed, driven underground where they await rediscovery by those willing to look beyond surface condemnation. In reclaiming Astaroth, contemporary occultists engage with something larger than individual practice, the ongoing human project of making meaning from mystery, finding wisdom in shadow, and discovering that the most interesting knowledge usually comes with warning labels. Whether Astaroth represents corrupted goddess, psychological archetype, or something stranger still matters less than what the figure enables. A space for engaging with whatever any given era finds too dangerous for general consumption. And if that's not a form of wisdom worth preserving, even through demonization, then perhaps the medieval theologians were right to be afraid. These are my references. I allow them on screen because very often they don't fit my info box. And thank you very much for watching up until this point. Super happy that you managed until the end. It means that you're very committed to your learning, and I'm so proud of you. Also, leave me a lion emoji in the comments if you watched until this point as an homage to Astaroth, Astarte. And let me know in the comments as well what you thought about this episode, whether you're a practitioner that's worked with Astaroth or Astarte. Let me know what are your thoughts, even your experiences, if you don't mind sharing. I would really appreciate that. Also, I'd like to remind you that this project is only kept alive thanks to you. So if you have the means to support it, I would massively appreciate it if you joined my Patreon community. It's a fantastic community. We have monthly lectures, a book club, a Discord server. We have monthly Zoom conversations as well. So often I get lots of questions via DMs or emails. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to reply to them all, but if you join my Patreon community, then you can ask me those questions live during one of our Zoom calls. So definitely recommended. Also check out my services at drangelapuca.com, my online courses and my tutoring sessions. And sign up for my newsletter. That's free and it allows you to stay in touch with me regardless of social media algorithm. And if you like this episode, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, activate the notification bell so that you will always be notified when I'm live or I upload a new video, and share this video around. That's a free way to support my project that I would really appreciate it. And thank you all so much for being here. I really hope that you stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now. Today we hold